Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is the nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are delighted because this is one of our first real collaborations through Charis at Agnes Scott, which is our new school store programming arm connected to Agnes Scott College. So we moved to Agnes Scott College in April of 2019. And then we were gearing up to have a huge year of programming in 2020 in community with Agnes Scott College, and of course the pandemic hit, and so we haven't gotten to do as many events, and particularly faculty author events, as we had originally planned. So this is really one of our first major ones, and we're thrilled to be honoring Dr. Katherine Smith tonight. So I'm going to be introducing Dr. Smith and her interviewer and conversation partner. I also want to let folks know you're already chatting wonderfully in the chat. We love that. Please keep it up. What we always want is for our virtual events to feel like our in-person events, which is, we want Charis to feel like a cozy living room. So we try to get as close to that as possible here online. You can click this teal button at the bottom of your screen at any time to buy the Accidental Possibilities of the City from Charis. And if you are local to Decatur, we'll put it on the front porch for you. You can pop by and pick it up. If you live anywhere in the United States, we can send it to you. If we know we got some folks living outside of the US, we will try and figure out, we can't send it to you, unfortunately, because we don't ship internationally, but we'll try and help you figure out how to get it to you wherever you live in the world. You can also click this Ask a Question button down at the bottom center of your screen at any point. It is not disruptive to ask a question. Even while folks are talking, they will begin to assimilate the questions into the conversation when it makes sense. So don't be shy. Please ask questions. We would love to have them populated in there. So I'm going to begin by introducing Susanneh Bieber. Susanneh is an assistant professor of modern and contemporary art history at Texas A&M University. Her research focuses on American art of the long 1960s in a transnational context, with a particular interest in the relationship among art, architecture, and the built environment. She has received fellowships from the Smithsonian American Art Museum and the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art. Her essay on inflatable architecture received the 2020 JAE Scholarship Design Award for Best Article of the Year, and her research on the origins of Judd's minimal art was awarded with the 2017 Terra International Essay Prize. Previously, Dr. Bieber worked as curator at the Tate Modern in London and the Fresno Metropolitan Museum in California. She received her PhD from the Freie University in Berlin. I apologize, Dr. Bieber. So we're thrilled to have you here with us tonight. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
And we're here tonight to celebrate this very, very important project by Dr. Katherine Smith. Dr. Smith is the professor of art history at Agnes Scott College, where she teaches modern and contemporary art and architecture, history, and theory. Her research focuses on intersections in post-war American art and architecture, with emphasis on sculpture and urbanism from an increasingly global perspective. She has written on the influence of post-war and contemporary art projects by Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown for Relearning from Las Vegas from University of Minnesota Press and Eyes That Saw Architecture After Las Vegas. Her research on Claes Oldenburg has appeared in several journals, including Archives of American Art Journal and Public Art Dialogue. Her book, which we are celebrating here tonight, The Accidental Possibilities of the City, Claes Oldenburg'S Urbanism in Postwar America, is available now. So welcome, yes, congratulations. We're so thrilled to be here and to be your school store celebrating with all of you near and far tonight.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, ER, for this wonderful introduction. And it's wonderful to be here all together. I'm really delighted to be able to celebrate with Katherine on this occasion, her book publication. So first of all, Katherine, I mean, thanks so much for inviting me, first of all, to the event, to be your interlocutor, and also just congratulations on such an achievement.
Thank you.
on publishing a book, doing the research, going through all the process of hard labor, of choice, of discoveries, but also of just having to continue and be steadfast in wanting to publish that book. So it's really, and I'm glad to see so many people in the audience.
It's really fun.
With you, exactly. So, and I saw you just put up a copy of the book so everybody could see it, just to have it in your hands and be able to look through it. And I can't wait to have my own copy.
Thank you.
So we will talk a little bit about the book, kind of more generally, and then kind of go through the individual chapters. As ER said, there is the bottom of your screen, so we can definitely take questions as we go, and then probably will answer additional ones towards the end of our conversation. So the first thing I really wanted to kind of ask you, Katherine, is about the process of your book and how it came about. As we just kind of mentioned, it is an incredibly long process. It has a long history. It's not just that you write it from the introduction, you know, through the chapters and to the epilogue. That would be a nice thing, and maybe it happens once you've written a few books. Some of the audience members have. But if you kind of tell us a little bit more about the process, how the book came about, what were the kind of maybe major events of discoveries or kind of light bulbs that came on your way to, you know, realizing and writing this book?
So I'm going to share my screen as part of a way to answer that question. But I have to say, I'm going to be very sad not to be able to watch all of these comments because it's so much fun to see all of you here. And I just want to say thank you for joining me for this. I've put a couple of comments into the chat, but I'm going to go away and go into the images. But it's just, there are very few silver linings of this pandemic, but this is one of them, to be able to be with people over space. And it's just, it means so much to me that so many of you are here. And many of you are directly thanked in the book. So all of you have had tremendous import in so yes, I hesitate to do this because I'm loving the comments. So keep them coming. I'll see them later. But here's so let me try to answer this question with a few images. So I want to start. So this is this book, as you said, has been a long process, and you've been in conversation with me for a lot of it, and I'm going to elaborate on that in a minute. So this book started in some ways 20 years ago. So when I was finishing up my graduate work, I took in my final semester, I took an architectural history course with Jean-Louis Cohen, who would be here, except that this doesn't really work well for those in Europe. And I read Learning from Las Vegas as part of that book. And in the process, stumbled across this quotation where the authors refer to the Caesar's Palace sign as lacquered like Oldenburg hamburgers. So if we look at these images, I think we can see the connection they're making, but they're not talking about size, they're talking about sheen. And that's, in my mind, a really strange connection to Oldenburg, because most people would have known his work as being large scale, which of course these figures also were. So that was really the first moment of curiosity. I thought there's got to be more to this story, that they're connecting to that element. And so I had a sense that Oldenburg was operating really more generally in their practice. So that was like a 1998 discovery. I went on to write a dissertation on Venturi, Scott Brown, on the influence of pop on their architecture. And I was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Smithsonian. When I was in the archives of American art one day, I found this drawing. And even though Ellen Johnson's handwriting tells us, the inscription here reads, Venturi's drawing, where he'd like to put the plug, parentheses, on top is where he'd really like it. Even though she identified this for me, I knew immediately when I saw it, because of the brown ink and the line quality and the script here, I knew immediately that this was one of Bob Venturi's drawings. This was the last page of a sketchbook, or it's still attached to its cardboard. It's about 3.5 by 5 inches. But I just thought it was this absolutely wonderful piece that needed to be talked about. So what you're looking at is the design, or one of the ideas that Venturi was working out when he and his firm were making an addition to the Allen Memorial Art Museum. So with these three different dots, he's trying to think about where he would reposition Claes Oldenburg's giant 3-way plug, which had to be moved because it sat on the site where the new addition was going to be built. So there was that discovery. And then about 5 years after I finished my dissertation, I was contemplating the fact that Oldenburg has worked indirectly, or in some cases quite directly, with multiple architects. And I thought, I wish somebody would write a book about that. I'd really like to read it. And then I thought, well, this is probably my book to write. So it was at this point that I applied to the Graham Foundation for a research grant so that I could start doing some archival research. I got that grant. And that was a really pivotal point, obviously, because it was validating for me that this was a topic worth pursuing. I will say that this was also the time when Christina Olson, who's here, I saw Christina in the chat, was inviting me to present with her in sessions at CCAC. And also almost the time just before, I think, Susanneh, you and I met. So in 2010, I think I have this right, we met on a panel that Julia Sinkovich chaired. It was the Society of Architectural Historians panel at the College Art Association. And I presented a paper on this image that you see in the upper right corner. And it was extremely exciting for me because I had spent the first part of my career, when I wasn't talking about exhibition designs that Venturi and Scott Brown had done, being rejected except from many different in many different areas, because I was told that my work was too art historical for the architectural historians and too architectural for the art historians. So there seemed to be some kind of shift for me in 2010. And one of the things that I often talk to my students about is that for me, scholarship is about having a conversation. It's about talking to the people who have already started thinking about the work that you want to do. And I just want to share with everyone that Christina and Susanneh, you have been some of the most important and most formative scholars for me. Susanneh, when we met on that panel, I felt like, because we both work on the 1960s and we both work between art and architecture, I had really found someone who could speak my language in a way that I hadn't yet discovered. So I just want to share that with the audience, especially with my students. And thank you again for being here to talk to me about this today.
Well, that's wonderful. And I remember so well being on the panel with you together and feeling very similar in terms of, do I feel within the art category or within the architecture category? And why isn't there more conversation that's happening? Right. So I was also very excited to have that conversation with you, and that it has continued over the years, and I think has become even deeper. Yes. And I think, yes, one of these things that I really appreciate about your book is this interdisciplinary aspect, of course, the art-architecture relationship. And that has often been, I think, addressed in terms of public sculpture, right? Kind of sculpture being placed within the built environment. But I think you push that a lot further in terms of thinking to how are there visual correspondences, material correspondences, conceptual relationships that Oldenburg makes with the built environment and with theories of urbanism. And I think there were really three things. So this interdisciplinary aspect that really kind of, I think, linked our research, but then also that you think about formal innovations. Oldenburg as a kind of, canonical artist, right? That works art, that works conceptual art, becomes an earth artist, but also that you're so interested in social art history and kind of contextualizing his work within, in this case, the built environment. And then also that you actually make this argument that, yes, it's not simply the relationship between art and the built environment, but you make a really strong argument that his art also functions as a type of social activism. So, and that's something maybe I want to pressure you here maybe a little bit more on that. How do you think that this social activism in relation to the built environment, how does that come out?
So
throughout your, is there a particular example that comes out?
Well, I think that I'm going to go a few slides forward here. And
sorry, I'm already breaking up our chapter.
No, it's okay. Well, so the first place my mind goes when you ask that question is I can go back to some of those other images if that makes sense for us after I try to answer this question, because this is really where I go first, because this is part of what I discovered about Oldenburg in the process of thinking through some of these early images, many of which I had never seen. At least many of the ones in my first chapter. And that's one of the things I'm particularly excited about this book. And I'm hearing a lot of feedback about the photographs that I talk about. So here are two of them. The head of a woman has been published. It was published in an exhibition catalog in 2012. But this image on the left, I think people will not have seen before. So when Oldenburg arrived in New York, he was primarily a painter. He had started doing some sculpture in Chicago, but he really made the shift to sculpture and part of what I argue is with this literal grappling with the environment in the East Village. And so one of the things I was discovering in reading interviews with him is the way that he started to see this work as social activism, as a way of taking from the environment, but giving back to the environment as well. And I see that in the way that he's attempting to make his work in multiple cases more accessible. I think we've often thought maybe not exactly in this way about the store, because I think a lot of his early career is still a little bit complicated, right? The store is a storefront that opens onto the neighborhood, but is also funded in part by a gallery. So he's attempting to challenge the establishment, but he's not ready to leave the establishment and doesn't really leave the art establishment. But I think he's thinking of ways to integrate himself into the environment. And I don't have an image of this, but the poster that he did for the store, arguably one of his best, if not his best known work from the early 1960s, includes Spanish. And part of the reason he did that is because he was mimicking the posters that he saw in the neighborhood. So I think that even though he was moving to the neighborhood as an immigrant from Chicago and attempting to establish this artistic practice, I think he's really thinking about how to integrate with the social aspects, with the environmental aspects. I think he's really working through that in ways that I'm trying to articulate in my first chapter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's exactly also kind of bringing out this relationship of art with the built environment, right? Which is all around us, which is all around Oldenburg at that time in New York, living in the kind of Lower East Side or then the East Village. So just kind of him engaging with that. And I think these amazing photographs that you unearthed and are part of your first chapter are just wonderful. And there too, I think it's really interesting, maybe for you or for others to know, how did you come about, finding these photographs, right? Because, I mean, Oldenburg is such a well-known artist. You would think all the artwork he's been created is already out there. So how did you go about, or where are all these photographs that are here published newly, both photographs and, of course, the sculptural objects and constructions?
So I have worked closely. I'll show you this one. So this is an image that was of a block that's between where Oldenburg lived on 4th Street, fairly far east, between Avenues C and D, and the store that he would open in 1961 on 2nd Street. So I found these photographs because he shared them with me. They were first published, and I think perhaps shown in the European exhibition, Claes Oldenburg, the 60s. There are, I think, 8 or 9 of them in that catalog, and they exist there, but they don't get more than a couple of sentences of attention. And I met Oldenburg for the first time in 2009. And I had, at that point, was sending him every publication that I was writing on his work and asking if I could come. And in fact, the first time I went to the studio was right before that College Art Association conference. I went to see what was left of the paint splats model, which is to say literally the splats are left, but the model of the building is no longer extant. So that was the first time I met him, and I have spent I think at least a day a year, most years, some more often, especially as I got close to finishing the book, and this was something that I really worked back into, because the three images that I showed you, the Venturi Scott Brown edition, the paint splats model, and the binoculars, those are my final chapters of this book. And I really built this book backwards, if you will, really to a large extent, with this material that he was willing to share with me and the information that he was willing to share with me. I was able to do many, many interviews and ask lots of questions. So if it were not for Oldenburg and his wonderful studio managers, several of whom I think are here, this would be a different book. This would be for sure, a different publication.
And talking a little bit more about these photographs, so they're kind of really showing the environment where he lived. Here in this case, you said it was right next to the store, where later the store would be. Right. Do you, and in your chapter, the argument is that there are kind of photographs in terms of an aesthetic practice. How do you differentiate them to a kind of notion of a documentary kind of practice in photography? Did they serve him simply kind of to then create material for his constructions, or you make the argument that they themselves are also kind of for him part of his creative and aesthetic practice?
So I think they were part of the practice of of really becoming accustomed to this environment. And it's my understanding that the photographs and the constructions really worked hand in hand, that he would go out and he would scavenge things from these lots. That's part of my argument, is that not only, I mean, literally his work is being built from things that he's finding in this environment, and often these are things that are coming from buildings. So we have an electrical box here. We have this sculpture that he's made out of nails and I think probably charred wood. This painting, that's a transitional painting here on the left. You can see, I hope if you look closely, that it's got some assemblage materials. There's a piece of wood at the top. We can see newspaper on the right, on the left-hand side, and on the bottom. So I remember talking to him and having him tell me that part of that most of his photographs were photographs of things that he took on the way to work. So he was walking through the East Village, and I could talk a little bit more about why I'm calling it that. Most of early publications call it the Lower East Side, but he was walking from from 4th Street, very far east, to Cooper Union to work. And so he says that often he was hurried, and he would have a camera with him. And so many of these are often are almost like snapshots. And really, I would say that I divide them, and actually I'm going to see if I can, I'm going to blow through my images here really quickly, because I want to get to a series at the very end that I put together that I think will help you see part of what I'm seeing. So while these may have been really hurried journeys, for the most part, and a lot of these do just look like he stopped and photographed something that he was interested in. And he said that he was particularly interested in shadows. I think you'll see that in a lot of these. But as I've looked at them, I've thought about various ways that I would start to categorize what he's doing. And I do this a little bit in the chapter, but I'll try to do it briefly here. So in these 3 examples, I see something much more composed than simply somebody on their way to work. And I think there are a number of these. These happen all to be automobiles and vehicles, but I think that's just coincidental. I think he does this with buildings too, and I have examples in the book that I think are better examples of that. I also think he has motion studies. So I think in these 2 that we're looking at on the left, he's looking at what happens when he moves forward slightly on the sidewalk, and he gets a slightly different frame. Or in the case of the 2 on the left, he's behind these pedestrians and he's waiting for them to move. And we have several series of this where he's doing sequential images. Incidentally, where he's standing on Broadway in these 2 on the right, looking toward Washington Square Park. So you can almost see this, but if you look at the sign on the lamppost, that reads 25. Just to the left of it, you can see the spire of the Judson Memorial Church. So another thing I did in looking at these photographs is I spent a lot of time trying to figure out where all of these are. So here are 2 examples of the destruction in this area that he is photographing. These seem very documentary to me. There are lots of versions of these. And then one of the other things that he talks about, and he talks about this in a lengthy interview, and he mentions, this is a Cummings interview for those who know that oral history project that was done at the Smithsonian. He also talks about how with a camera he could make things look large. And I think that this is an example. He does this with Head of a Woman. I think he does this here also with an ironing board, probably on the roof of his 4th Street building. And I'm suggesting here that part of what I think he's starting to do is he's starting to find this material that will come back later, as in this proposal for a colossal monument for the Lower East Side, his neighborhood.
Mm-hmm. And I think that will be a very good transition to the next chapter in terms of talking very much about kind of the Lower East Side or the East Village. And so in your second chapter, you explore the store, one of the major environments and that has been discussed in terms of Oldenburg's work, but you really pay attention to the different incarnations of the stores in its 3 different locations. So if you could talk a little bit more about that and how you kind of contextualize that, that would be exciting.
Sure. I'm going to jump back to the beginning of this. So here's a preview of the rest of the book again. So I really wanted to say something new about the store. And that felt really challenging because this is I would say probably of all of Oldenburg's projects, this is the one that has been written about the most. So I'm showing you here as a way of introduction, I'm showing you some of the storefronts that he photographed, or the billboards and the signage that he photographed in the area. And all of these were within blocks of his apartment and within blocks of the store that he opened on 2nd Street. So I keep referring to that one. That's the center, the middle exhibition, and that's the one most people know about. The first and last have gotten less attention, but I would say this one especially has gotten less attention. So the very first incarnation of the store, or the store sculptures, was in a group show at a gallery on the Upper East Side. There are very few records, photographic records of this project. But I hope you can see from the color image in the upper right that he had installed these sculptures on the mezzanine level of this gallery. So you walked up the stairs and some of them were hanging freely in space. That's what you can see on the left. And then most of them wrapped the walls. So what you're looking at in the bottom right image, in the black and white image, which is an image that I discovered during my research, this comes from the Martha Jackson Gallery archives, is what you're looking at kind of from a side view. It's on the side wall of the top image. And part of what I was interested in is in this, because Oldenburg had this idea that he was going to actually show this as a shop window, and that it would be apparent through the glass wall, front wall of the gallery. And because of where he ultimately installed this, it didn't work out that way. But part of what I'm interested in is the way that this piece really instantiated these drawings that he was doing of his movement through the streets of the lower parts of Manhattan. So you can see, if you look, he does these, he calls them clusters, he calls them plaques. I'm not the first person to recognize that. Nadja Rodner has written about these and has written about the ways that they capture his perspective and his mobile perspective in the street. But what I was interested in is the way that when he hangs these, especially, you can see this behind him. So there's Oldenburg standing in this bottom image in silhouette. And you can see that he is hanging all of these sculptures on top of each other. And he doesn't do that in later versions of this show. Part of what I talk about in my chapter is the way that this was received, and the way that often these works were seen. They were compared to a rummage sale, for instance. They were in this Upper East Side gallery, and people talk about these as being used. And they weren't. They were new sculptures, but I think they were really inflected by this particular location in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, and also by what was going on elsewhere in the gallery, where there were actual the objects that were being shown rather than these that were being recreated. So if you're not familiar with these are works that are done in plaster. So this is plaster on top of chicken wire. And then colored, painted with enamel paint that he found in a downtown paint store. So these are three examples, and you're seeing on the left the interior of the store as he installed it at 107 East 2nd Street. This was a storefront studio that he rented. He made the sculptures in the back. He sold them in the front. So part of what I am doing in this chapter is thinking about what it meant to do this in this area at this time. And one of the things I'm suggesting is that not only was Oldenburg looking at the media, right, looking at the popular culture, again, part of his association with pop, he's looking at the signage, he's looking at the advertising. But I think that he's turning that advertising through the material realities of this landscape that he's capturing in these photographs. I think these bumpy and fragmentary and really coarse kinds of sculptures that he's creating. I mean, no one would confuse any of his sculptures with the actual objects. I think that it's this very complex amalgamation of the sign culture and these deteriorating buildings that he's really putting together when he does these projects. At the same time, he's working from newspaper clippings, and this is well known. This is not something that I'm establishing in this book. But one of the things I'm interested in is are these source books. He had 2 of these, and these I think are really exciting works that haven't yet been studied enough. And I'm showing you 2 examples that I think he's put together in when he's creating this fur jacket, which is in Basel. And he's taking the photograph, he's taking these newspaper images and he's coloring them and he's shading them and he's cutting them. And so he's instantiating these fragments in these fragmentary sculptures. And I realize now, Susanneh, I didn't answer your question about where the photographs are. But now that I'm looking at these, I think it's an important thing for me to go back and pick up, which is to say that when I looked at all of these, they were still in the Oldenburg Van Bruggen studio in New York. But they are now at the Getty. So the Oldenburg Van Bruggen papers were sent to the Getty about a year and a half ago. And my understanding is that they hired an archivist or had made an offer to an archivist just as the pandemic started to shut everything down. So the source books are there, the notebook pages are there, the photographs are there. It's going to be this incredible repository for, I hope, more work on Oldenburg and Van Bruggen. So I'll try to talk about these a little bit more briefly. So one of the things that I talk about in my chapter is the fact that the East Village is becoming its own neighborhood during this time. If you read the literature and even recent literature on the store, it's often discussed as being in the Lower East Side. But in fact, the East Village is being established at exactly this point. The 3rd Avenue L was destroyed in 1955. The artists started to move out of Greenwich Village because rents were being raised. And so they started moving east into the East Village, and it became this neighborhood that was starting to change. It was starting to get reshaped with this, when these ethnic communities started to meet these new artists. And there was lots of new construction that was happening during this period for artists. They were building buildings within blocks of the store that would be artist residences. But one of the things I discovered that for me really bolstered this idea that Oldenburg is in dialogue with the ruins of this neighborhood when he creates the store. And this is what I think we see in the image on the left, that as far as I can tell, he took shortly after the store closed. If we look across the street, you can see that there's rubble that's snow dusted. So there was a construction site across the street as the store was opened. But it was to be the site of the Roosevelt houses. I'm showing you a page from the New York Times that showed that planned community that was just starting. So it was a site that had been demolished and it was just starting to be rebuilt as Oldenburg was opening the store in December of 1961. This is his last incarnation of the store. These are some of the store pieces with the addition of these soft sculptures. I would say this is the other work for which he's best known. There is the dual hamburger that I showed you at the beginning. Right on the right, the floor burger in the back, the popsicle, and Price is hanging on the wall. We've seen that too. So these were all works that were shown in the Green Gallery. And part of what I'm thinking through with the Green Gallery is the fact that it's in a really different part of Manhattan. And again, I'm not the first scholar to acknowledge that. There are piano stores nearby, there are car showrooms nearby, and Oldenburg has talked, and scholars have talked about how the scale of this work starts to change because the products here are different. Whereas the store downtown with the accessories, with the food, really for the most part, mimicked things that would have been bought and sold in that neighborhood. The scale here with the soft sculptures is really different. And one of the things that I think happens is that Oldenburg walks 2.5 blocks from the Green Gallery, probably to get on the subway to go home. He and his wife, Patty Muko, who was the seamstress who created these soft sculptures for him, were taking the subway up to this area for the entire summer before they opened the show. So at some point, I think Oldenburg stopped probably at 57th Street and looked south on Park Avenue and created this work, created this sketch for the Good Humor Bar that then became one of his proposals for monuments 3 years later.
Okay, great. Thanks for exploring that. And we actually have a few questions in the chat that might work very well here.
Great.
In terms of the aspects that you're addressing.
Great.
Okay, well, two of them actually were already answered in terms of the scale that was basically being asked. David Brownlee asked about, yes, when did he change from the smaller advertisements to this larger scale? And I guess you're saying that's exactly right here when it happens.
That's what I think. I mean, he doesn't get to these proposals until 1965, after he leaves New York and goes to Los Angeles and goes to Europe and then comes back to New York and works on these. But the scale changes. I mean, he goes, well, I guess this is a slightly more complicated answer, which is to say that he had actually done a larger scale work close to the floor burger, the floor cone, the floor cake as part of his happenings downtown. That was really the first large scale piece. But I think his interest in large scale sculpture that wasn't a prop for happenings starts at least in my understanding, starts at the Green Gallery in that exhibition. And I think I have these. These are wonderful. And then he takes them to Los Angeles, or he takes the cone to Los Angeles and makes the blue shirt, brown tie for a show at the Dwan Gallery. And he and Dennis Hopper take these sculptures all around New York. Now they had driven, he and Muka, from what I understand, had driven the floor cone down 57th Street. So that was really the first time they put a large scale work in the city. And then he did it again with Dennis Hopper. And I think these are really wonderful and wonderfully both retrospective and prescient images for where he's been with this car and some of his scavenged early pieces and scavenged sculpture, and where he's going to go next in his interest in sculptural buildings and even some of his challenges to modern architecture, which I think we also see in the Good Humor Bar.
Yeah, and that's, I remember when I first saw these photographs that I think I saw them as part of an essay that you published, and just how delightful they are, how fun. I could just imagine myself in the car and driving around and kind of carrying around this huge sculpture. Yeah. And so I think there is also this humor, right? That's part of his work that I think is so intriguing and kind of brings you in and immerses you in his work. And this kind of leads us to the chapter where you talk about these larger public monuments. Particularly also it's built around the Plastic Civic Monument, the holes, so to speak. And as part of that, you talk more about this Good Humor Bar, and it's one of my favorite chapters too, because you just kind of create a relationships between his sculptures and the built environment that is just so fluid and works so easily.
Oh, thank you.
So the idea of the Good Humor Bar, if you want to kind of talk a little bit about that relationship that then moves you to the Placid Civic Monument.
Sure. So this is, as you just mentioned, these are from my third chapter entitled Holes. And so I talk primarily about three of the projects. And this is one. This is the project that takes us from the second to the third chapter by way of Los Angeles and these large sculptures in the city. So when Oldenburg goes traveling and then comes back to New York, he starts to envision or continues to envision, perhaps I should say, these his large scale objects in the city. This one I am also particularly fond of because he sees this as, and this is not atypical for him, he often uses his objects as substitutes for buildings, for monuments. So in this case, he sees the Pan Am building, which would have still been under construction in 1962, as a Good Humor Bar. So when Kosha Van Brooken wrote about this drawing or this painting. I think you could see it both ways. She talked about the fact that we see two different positions for this stick. So we see the prominent yellow one, and we see this hint of this outline just to its right, forming a different diagonal leaning toward the upper right side. And so what she suggests is that this ice cream is melting. And so what I'm suggesting in this chapter is that this is both playful, but also really brilliant in terms of its proposal for a modernist building. Several corporate headquarters were built in the modernist style in these blocks just above Grand Central Station on Park Avenue. The Seagram building is probably one of the more famous, the Lever House. And so corporations are commissioning these architects to design these buildings that are orderly, that are transparent, that become this paradigm of corporate structure in the 1950s and early 1960s in New York. So the curtain wall, which is the glass wall on the exterior of these buildings, is really one of their defining features. So Oldenburg has this idea that what he can do is just create a sheath that can go right over the building. And it mimics its rectangular form. And I think it's this really witty take on a curtain wall. But at the same time, if we listen to Van Brooken's interpretation, this is melting. So in essence, what he's suggesting is that it's an object that will ultimately become a whole, which will take it back to what this site looked like the first time he saw it. Because when he first saw the site in the 1950s, the decade earlier, he saw this as a void because all of these large buildings that were rising around it made Grand Central look, and made the central part of Park Avenue look like a hole. And then he remembers the excavation at the beginning of this. So it's this structure that really seems also to be in the process of undoing itself. It seems to be manifesting this kind of dissolution, which I'm suggesting is at play in multiple monuments. So I think about this one. I think about this one too in this book, and this is one of the places where my research and Susanneh's research intersect. And this is exciting to me that we can have these conversations about these projects. So part of what I think about with this proposed colossal monument for the intersection of Canal Street and Broadway. So this sits in what we think of as Chinatown. He creates this large, as he says, large concrete block that would block all pedestrian and vehicular travel in both directions. So I think about this not only in terms of what's happening with traffic flow generally in New York, say with Broadway, but also what's happening, and this is something Susanneh writes about what's happening with discussions on the lower Manhattan Expressway that wouldn't actually go through exactly this intersection, but sometimes is called the Canal Street Expressway. So that's part of what I'm showing you in this New York Times article. But I'm also interested in the fact that there was a plan that was not ever built for a new civic monument, a new civic building and park. And this intersection would have been the northwest corner of that. It was in the news when Oldenburg was thinking about this. But in the same way that he added something to the city, he developed here another project that would ultimately have created a hole, because had he actually built this, it would have been, of course, so heavy that it would have crushed the subways underneath it and would have basically created this giant pothole instead of this obstacle monument, ultimately, which is part of what he calls this when he creates it. And I read both of these as related to the Placid Civic Monument that Susanneh mentioned. This is the one that I talk mostly about in this chapter, part of the Sculpture and Environment show that was organized by the city. It took place over the month of October in 1967, and Oldenburg's contribution to that show was to create this hole in Central Park, very close to Cleopatra's Needle, an obelisk that had been located there in the 19th century, and right behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So you're looking at the hole that was dug in a few hours. The grave diggers who dug it went to lunch, came back and refilled it and then it reemerged, and then it merged with the park itself. I could say way more about this, but Susanneh, I think I'll let you tell me if you want to hear more.
Yeah, I think what I'd like to do here is a little bit pressure you on this term of Oldenburg as a pop artist, particularly when you have kind of these enlarged monuments with the good humor bar. There are good humors, there are objects, and that's also why we often got kind of put into this category of pop art. But then we have that obstacle monument that is much more like a cube. Then we have Placid Civic Monument, which of course is much more like an earthwork. So there's all these different designations, but would you still kind of make this term of pop productive for Oldenburg? Is that something you feel works for his work even more particularly or even more broadly defined?
Well, I think it's a term that I try to resist in this book because I think it's historically, and I don't think this is just true for Oldenburg. I think that pop generally has been a term that has really reduced the way we've understood a lot of these artists. So I'm thinking, for instance, about Michael Lobel's work on Liechtenstein and his work on Rosenquist, and the way that he also is and other scholars who look at the 1960s, you among them. I think that there is a level of complexity to what these artists are doing, and that even at the time when they were considered pop artists, when that term emerged, I think that it was a term that was confining based on subject matter. And I think that, at least in the case of Oldenburg, the majority of the work on him is still on the decade of the 1960s. And part of my motivation in broadening this book kind of backwards and forwards from that decade was to think beyond the store, beyond the soft sculptures, and to really think about the complexities that exist in that practice beyond the subject matter, because I do think that his objects are accessible. I think much of his work is funny, and I think that it, as a result, gets attention. But I think that his work is often more nuanced than we have always given it credit for.
And I guess that would be the question: can we kind of reframe the idea of pop art, that it's not just subject matter, but it actually maybe even goes into the direction of social activism, right? The kind of idea of not just creating something for a mass audience, but also doing work that intersects with the public or with public ideas of the civic. That is, part of everybody's life, and not just thinking about it in terms of an elitist art, but one that can, communicate with different audiences, but also has different levels and different meanings.
I think that the current generation of scholars is doing that, and I think that's exciting. I hope we can do that.
Yeah, and that's, I think also, coming back to your claim of Oldenburg's work as social activism, I think that's also something really exciting that I feel might, be a trajectory that others will follow. I know we are kind of needing to move forward, but we can certainly come back to that maybe in the Q&A question. And I know you particularly also relate the Placid Civic Monument to the issues of Central Park that are going on at the moment. But I think let's maybe go over that and move on to your next chapter, because in a way what you said also, right, you wanted to kind of move beyond the 60s, Oldenburg of the 60s, and these later projects where you work directly with architects were so exciting for you. And I think that's also, again, relationships comes out. So I think, do you want to talk more about the plug, or what's your preference at this point? And I don't know how long we actually have in terms of time.
So I think we have until 9.
Okay.
And I get, because I can't see any of the chat and I can't see any of, I don't know how everybody else is doing. I'm happy to keep talking about this. But I guess we're not getting questions. Is that right?
We do actually. So maybe we can actually there's a few questions. I think that water. So let's actually answer those.
Yeah, let's take the questions.
More lively. So Susan Batker, of course, who's written much on Oldenburg and earthwork, and particularly the Placid Civic Monument.
Yes.
So she asked particularly about whether Oldenburg required you to show him your manuscript. So was there a kind of approval process with the copyright, with the pictures, with quotations that you can use?
So Oldenburg has not seen the writing in the manuscript, but he has, I mean, obviously approved the images and also the quotations, but he hasn't read the book. I will be shipping him a book tomorrow, and that's the first time I think he'll see the text. We have very rarely talked about my interpretations of his work. Although he did. I mean, I mentioned that I sent him my early publication. So he has everything that I've published, but he doesn't have this. And the only thing I've ever talked to him about in terms of my interpretation of the project is the Placid Civic Monument. That's because I gave a College Art Association talk on it a few years ago, and I did share my discussion about what I thought it was doing in the Central Park, in some of the changes in Central Park at the time. But otherwise, no. Does that answer your question? That's a good question, but. Yeah, so approval of the quotations, approval of the images, but not approval of the interpretation.
Mm-hmm. And a follow-up question that works quite well with that from Carrie, who asked if the writings by Van Bruggen, if they are a useful lens on his or their work, and how has that played into your interpretations?
So very helpful. I think that Van Bruggen's writing on their work is incredibly articulate and incredibly insightful, and also really important archivally. I think there are several publications that she did that take really a trajectory through his early career before they started working together, which happened in 1976, 77. So just after this project, the paint splats was one of their first designs together. I never met her, but I really wish I had. Yet I think that her voice comes through so clearly in the writing that she did on his work and on their work, and it plays a really important role in my last two chapters because she writes about this. She writes about the three-way plug at Oberlin. Mm-hmm. And she wrote about the paint splats. She wrote about binoculars. So you'll find that in my footnotes for sure, and in my text as well, that I really engage her interpretations of these works.
Okay, and I think let's move maybe to those last projects that you're talking in your last two chapters. So we have this kind of practice where he really works more directly with architects, and then I think that shows us a real kind of interesting aspect of how he develops his work from the 60s onwards.
So I'm going to go forward a few slides. Actually, I'll stop here because I love this juxtaposition, makes me so happy. So this is a postcard of Oldenburg with the three-way plug when it was installed. And this is a photograph of Robert Venturi, I am guessing, when he came to do early site visits for the addition. And there is something about these two photographs that just seems so quintessentially characteristic of both of these personalities as I've known them. I think it's really wonderful, and I think it's indicative of really what they both thought about this sculpture. So I want to be clear that this, in my mind, is not necessarily a project in which Oldenburg directly worked with Venturi. But from what I can tell in all of the paperwork that I've seen about this project, I don't think that there was any obligation on Venturi's part to think about what to do with the three-way plug. But part of what I got really interested in when I was looking at the archives is the way that over and over again at multiple stages in the design project, Venturi engages the plug, reconsiders the plug, wants to put the plug on the roof of the building, wants to put it in these three, wants to try out these three locations as the early drawing indicated. But one of the things, I guess there were two things that finally were so, I thought really important to me when I was thinking about this at the end. And I should say at the end of my process, because this was the work that this was the chapter that was most clearly drawn from work in my dissertation. So I'm going to talk briefly about the first one, which is to say that while I think Venturi has historically been a big fan of Oldenburgs, and he talks about that in interviews and how much he likes him and how much they learned from him. And obviously he moved the plug around conceptually in relation to his building for a few years before Oldenburg himself repositioned it nowhere, and that Venturi had suggested this was a totally different location farther away from the building and actually turned backwards to the street, which I think is a particularly intriguing choice. One of the things that I came to believe at the very end of this writing project is that Denise Scott Brown really understood Oldenburg's work and his position within the art establishment, and his desire to make work that was accessible and anti-elitist. And in many ways, many of the things that she and Venturi were attempting to do when they studied vernacular symbolism. Often she was writing the syllabi for their studios, and this is something I don't have in images, but I talk about in the chapter, is I think she had this really profound and really prescient understanding of what Oldenburg was trying to do and the ways that it really hooked up to the project that they were working out in architectural and pedagogical studies. So I really came to appreciate that in a way that I hadn't. But I also started to think increasingly about what Oldenburg learned from this experience of having to move his sculpture and then reposition it. And he did this print in 1979 for the museum. And I've never really, it took me a long time to think clearly about what I thought he was doing, because part of what's happening is that he exchanges the places between the addition and the sculpture. So he has reduced the addition to these two interconnected blocks, and he's positioned that where his sculpture is, and now he's magnified his plug, and he suggested that it could be this like infinitely repeating modular gallery system, perhaps. But part of what I ultimately came to think about is the ways that thinking through this addition and to an original museum likely played out in his own designs for the Mouse Museum and the Ray Gun Wing, which he was doing. I didn't bring images of those, but that's something that he was doing at exactly this time. So I think he learned from Venturi and Scott Brown, and I think they were helpful for him later, for him and Van Brooken when they did the designs for Houston. But I also know that Venturi and Scott Brown learned from Oldenburg, and his work continued to permeate their designs into the next decade. And just quickly, here are three examples of those, one of which Venturi talks about in project notes as explicitly drawn from and comparable to an Oldenburg.
And could you talk a little bit more about this difference between, like, having a drawing and then having to really think about this idea of realizing something on such a large scale? Is there something that's in one way gained? Are there other things that are being lost when that translation happens from drawing or from sculpture to large and permanent environments or sculptures that are in the built environment?
I think you posed this question to me last week, and I've been thinking about it. And part of what I think is potentially lost is some of the critical dimension that I think happens say with some of his proposals, especially the proposals for monuments that are destructive in various ways to their environments. And I've been thinking a lot about those. And I'm going to jump forward several images. So that was part of what I was thinking about when I was thinking through those. And this is your point. You talk about the fan and the oscillating blades of the fan as being related, or being his transformation in this case of the spokes of the crown. I think that's a fantastic observation. And it also, of course, then turns this object into this dynamic situation where he's blowing winds toward the southern part of Manhattan and disturbing the waterways surrounding them. But I was thinking about this too, and this was something, this series of images in part close my last chapter, which is to say that the binoculars are the architectural work that Venturi, well, arguably architecturally, the literature and calls these alternately sculpture and architecture, and I think I ultimately call them sculpture. But we have these functional binoculars in the middle of Frank Gehry's Chiat Day building in fact, I think came from the source book from the early 1960s. That's the first place I was able to find binoculars in Oldenburg's career. But you were asking about what gets lost. And I think then in this particular case, I think some things get lost and some things are gained. So this watercolor on the left is a design for what might have been a building as part of a performance in Venice, Italy, that they did in collaboration with Gehry. And so my understanding is that Oldenburg came up with the idea for the binoculars, and then Van Broeken and Gehry decided that it was going to become this kind of hybrid building, if you will. So originally it was a library, but it was a library ultimately that was going to be attached to a theater, or vice versa. It was a theater, it was going to be attached to a library, and they had this idea that they could show film on the back of it, but this was all going to be potentially a floating object in the lagoon in Venice. And so ultimately it later becomes this piece, and there's a famous story about how Gehry was being pressed by J. Chiat about how he was going to finish the center of this building, and this maquette from Venice was on his desk, and Gehry picks it up and puts it in the center of the building, and they both like it, and they call Oldenburg and Van Broeken and say, will you work on this? And ultimately ultimately, obviously it was realized, but what you're seeing in this black and white image is part of what Van Broeken talks about when she writes, I think, the most important account of this performance that did actually happen, but never happened with the kinds of architectural structures that they had envisioned. And she talks about the fact that the transition between this object and a functional building was too difficult to figure out at that point. And that wasn't the only reason, as I understand, that they dropped the idea of these architectural structures. But then they had to figure it out when these binoculars then moved to Venice, California. And I think that ultimately these really subtle connections between the building and the binoculars happen. And I think the binoculars ultimately, when they change color, when they change shape, when they get all of these curvilinear details, I think they become a really much more engaging presence than they were in their original burgundy and somewhat cylindrical and totally symmetrical forms. Mm-hmm. I don't know that answers your question, but that was part of what I've been thinking about in the last week in order to answer it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, it's just also the materiality and having to realize it actually in this three-dimensional form adds something. And I mean, I guess the thing is, of course, also that then it is part of the environment, and there's light influences of light, right? People see it differently. Yep. It initially seems like the scale remains the same, but of course we do see it in photographs, we see it walking up, we see it being inside of it. So it's just a kind of different experience. Mm-hmm. But I do think that the drawings are the wonderful thing about the drawings, it's like you can't just imagine, them in different ways. There's just, it seems like that's a wonderful thing about art, right? It's also, it is so open. There is so much more possibility about the ideas and these proposals.
Well, and he talks about that. I mean, he talks about the fact that in the proposals, the audience has to cite them, right? Because he gives he'll sometimes tell us, I mean, the intersection, he'll tell us the area of Manhattan. I mean, I'm thinking mostly about the ones for New York, but the way that those works, those compositions are structured with very few visual details of the environment. I think you really do have to work at situating them in the places he intended. And I think that that's part of the engagement that he meant to have, in the same way that he meant, of course, I mean, in reality, this doesn't happen, but he talks about how he would have to go in and like punch around the soft sculptures sometimes, like he would have to handle them. And that was part of their design. And he intended audiences in some cases and collectors to do that too. Of course, that's not the reality. But I see it as another manifestation of that impulse on his part to make art that requires agency from the audience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I want to maybe just for this part move to the questions, so we have a little bit more interaction. There's a number of them, and just kind of go through them, no matter kind of whether they right now fit. But I think, and then we can come back maybe to some final comments.
Okay,
but,
I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can come back.
Yeah, exactly. Do you actually see the questions too?
I can read some of them.
Okay, so there's one about, let's see.
To go up.
Yeah, there was the very early one that I hadn't come to is this, and I think it goes into your idea of this embodied vision that you also make a really important pillar of your book, and that reappears throughout your chapters. So this idea of Oldenburg's perspective of scale. Is it about looking as a first person, his journeys through the street, his body's relation to the size of all these works? Is the translation to other bodies and third person? So that's this kind of idea of an embodied vision. Basically, how does that play out? Is that basically thinking about different processes, or is that incorporating different considerations?
I am not sure that I fully followed that question. So I can see comments, but I think I'd have to scroll up to see the question. Let me see.
Yeah, it's the very first one.
Okay.
Is the translation to other bodies and third persons in the spaces that he walks through, is that a different process or even a consideration for him? Is that important? So maybe if you can talk a little bit more about this importance of the embodied vision that you address in your projects, how that does play out in a number of his projects.
So I do see that as something that he starts to develop in his work in the Lower East Side, East Village very early, in part simply from the shift to from painting to sculpture, and that he literally was going out and gathering these things from the streets, and then coming back and making these three-dimensional objects, so that it seemed important to him to handle these. I think the photographs were relatively short-lived. I think there was a real need to move from 2 to 3 dimensions. I think about if you look at his diaries, he talks in one of his very first entries that's published. I'm thinking about the Writing on the Side piece that was published by the museum, or book that was published by the Museum of Modern Art in conjunction with his 2012 exhibition there. He talks about black and white facades, and then he talks about watching workers tear up the asphalt. And so that this idea of form was so integral to his experience of the city, moving from facade to form pretty quickly. And I think that then the trajectory of his career, I think that it shows up in the store in the sense that having this storefront studio and exhibition space, I think that people didn't, but I think they were invited in potentially to touch his sculptures. I mean, they were sitting on chairs, they were sitting on tables, they were displayed in a way that much of the work or much of the commerce in the Lower East Side was displayed. And part of what I talk about through newspaper articles about that area is how important it was for people to be able to handle those goods, and that was something characteristic of shopping in that particular area. So I think and then I think when he moves to the soft sculptures and he moves to the larger pieces in the Green Gallery, he talks about, and this is what I think Denise Scott Brown picks up on years later, he talks about how those works, because they are so large and because they are painted, that when you move around them, because that surface is shiny, it changes when you see it from different perspectives, not just because of the form, but also because of the surface. It's something I think he talks a little bit about in his very early exhibitions on the street. But I think he talks about it increasingly when the work starts to get larger. The sculptures start to get larger in scale.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I was interested too, you saying that you felt that Denise Scott Brown was really the understanding of Oldenburg's work. Mm-hmm. It's almost like she could understand or be much more kind of, I don't know if it's empathy or just kind of being able to understand, what another person was interested, or he as an artist was trying to do, and be able mm-hmm. to take him on his terms rather than just on the architectural term. Right. And I think that it's important too, and there's a question from Nell Ruby about these partnerships also mm-hmm. that play out. So we have Venturi Scott Brown, of course, right. and Scott Brown only recently also got recognition for her work. There was right. the real big discussion about the
Pritzker Prize, yes.
her being not included. And then it's the same, Christo and Jean-Claude would be another mm-hmm. example that
right.
here provides. And then, of course, we have Oldenburg, who worked with Patty Mucha early on, and then with Van Bruggen. How do you see those relationships? Should they get more acknowledged? What does it mean also, in our time to write a monograph
right.
of a white male, rather successful artist who is canonical? Are we kind of reinforcing notions of patriarchy that we very much try to kind of broaden and undermine?
There was a lot in that question. I'm going to try to
about the partnerships. That was that question. I elaborated a little bit.
So I'm going to try to unpack some of it, but I do want to go back to Denise Scott Brown and her relationship with Oldenburg for a minute, because part of what I ultimately arrived at is that her project and his project were so similar. She had studied Los Angeles, for instance. She had taken, and then Martino, who may or may not be here, Martino talks about this in his work on Venturi Scott Brown, how photography was important to her early career. And I think that while she couldn't have known Oldenburg's photographs, I think that their way of embodying vision, because I think this happens in the Learning from Las Vegas project too, embodying vision not just in the study, but also in the representation of those environments. I think there was a really important intersection there. And I think that in the projects that she's giving her students, when you look at some of the studio notes, I think that's part of where that comes out. I think she's talking about and thinking about Oldenburg's work in really significant ways. So these partnerships. So it's true that somebody pointed out to me that I have worked for much of my career on these artistic partnerships in which women are mostly eclipsed. And that was true of Venturi Scott Brown, which is to say that if you look at the literature, even when we know that there are projects that were done collaboratively, they're assigned to Venturi. And when early in my career, one of the things Denise said to me that I took as a very high compliment, she said, "You are one of the younger scholars," this was a while ago, "you are one of the young scholars who works hard to get it right." And I don't think she was talking as much about interpretation, though I hope she enjoys my interpretations of their work. I think she was talking about the historical record and how much attention I pay to trying to make my writing as much of a historical document for other scholars as I do an analysis of the objects themselves or the buildings themselves. So I've been really careful. And I do remember early in my career, I was a student of Linda Nochlin. I worked for Miriam Shapiro. I was trained by formative feminists. And I remember when I was writing the dissertation on Venturi Scott Brown, I got pushback about how I could write about the two of them and why wasn't I just writing about her? Or why wasn't I writing about another project? And so what I would say is I've been very careful as much as possible to reflect what I think is historically accurate, but to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting or undermining the projects that were done collaboratively. So I'm trying to assign that whenever I can. That was true for my dissertation. I think that's true for this book as well. I think collaborations are complicated. In terms of what does it mean to write on a canonical white male artist at this point, I think I'm telling a new story. I hope I'm telling a new story. And I feel like this story found me. And I had to write it, and my next story will be different. But this story really felt like one that I thought needed to be told.
Maybe then also the question is, what do you think you hope to achieve with the book? What will come out of it? How will other and younger scholars use that particular book and your research?
Well, I hope it will start more conversations generally, both for me and for other people who are interested in Oldenburg. I got an email earlier from Richard Saba, whose sculpture is in my book as a comparison to the Placid Civic Monument. And one of the things he said is, I've really started to think about the difference between those two projects, both of which were excavations in landscapes. So to receive that email was so heartening to me, because that's really what I want, is for people to see things, is for this book to invite people to see things or to rethink things. And I hope also that it will invite more scholarship beyond the 1960s. I hope it's a contribution to the dialogues about pop that you've already raised. And I think that a lot of these images that I'm publishing for the first time, and that now are at the Getty and will be differently accessible once the cataloging of that collection starts, I think that there's a lot of material that has been unexplored for those who are interested in both Oldenburg and Van Bruggen's careers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I like how you say, how the work will kind of teach us how to look differently. And there's a great comment by Lane Porter, or a question. So asking, and particularly talking about the binoculars, which are so interesting in terms of basically looking, the idea of looking, Oldenburg looking at the city. And in this case, we cannot look through these binoculars. They're focused on the ground or on the sidewalk.
Yes.
We can look at the thing, namely the binoculars, the sculpture, the architecture. But we are usually supposed to look through it. So we are engaging with a familiar subject in an unfamiliar context that draws attention to that context. So, and here the question, how can or should the audience participate or interact with that sculpture? Or, do you have any other thoughts about this phenomenon of looking and being looked at?
So that's something that recent scholars have talked about. I'm thinking about work specifically done by Eric Valentin in his 2 books, they're in French. But one, he talks about the binoculars as being a critique of the social situation in Venice, California, and in the decades before and during the time that building was built. So he sees that choice as extremely critical on Venturi, on Oldenburg and Van Bruggen's part. So I read them a little differently. I read them in the urban design of Venice, California. And this is part of what closes my last chapter. I talk about the fact that Venice, that the tension between Venice and Los Angeles is they're very distinct communities, that while Los Angeles has historically been shaped by the highway and shaped by vehicular transportation, Venice is really pedestrian. And that if we look at the design of those binoculars and the way that they ultimately attach to the building, they attach by 2 tiny little corridors. So that's part of why I continue to call them a sculpture, even though Oldenburg and Van Bruggen have talked about the fact that Gary said you have to put windows because it's not architecture unless it has windows. So they tried to hide the windows in some of the curves of the binoculars, and they recognized the difficulty of making a functional sculpture in this case. But part of what I think is that they're really, that part of the way we are meant to interact with them is to walk around them, because if you're standing on that sidewalk, you can walk fully around the binoculars. They attach to the building on the 2nd floor. And I think that invitation is so indicative of Oldenburg sculpture historically. I think it's another example of them choosing to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, wonderful. And it's wonderful how, in a way, these different ideas of art and architecture come together then in this particular sculpture, where it is both functional, but it also remains so symbolic. It's like different levels of meanings. So.
Right. It was an advertising agency. And while, again, Valentin read this as a kind of blindness, a comment on blindness, I read it as refocusing on the sidewalk and exactly where Oldenburg started his career, on the streets and sidewalks of New York.
All right. Let's see if there are any other questions. I think we went through most of them. I think maybe we didn't answer all of the questions, but
I see Megan was asking about a comment on capitalist projects, melting corporate monuments and headquarters. Yeah, I think possibly. I think it's also really funny that, that it's in some ways that all of those buildings were so, important in terms of objects. So the idea that instead of using this other architectural language, right, that was about transparency and order, he sticks an object, right? He sticks but Good Humor, to be clear, did not have their corporate headquarters on this part of Manhattan. That would have been even funnier, but they weren't there. And I see all that is solid. Yes, there's definitely marks in. I see comments about that. Yes, that's definitely in the book, the dissolution of things. Oh, Nell is telling me that the questions are not here. I need to be looking for them somewhere else. Thank you. Thank you.
Looks like. It looks like Katherine left us for a short time.
I'll bring her back. Don't worry.
Okay, that sounds good.
There we go. I think she just clicked the wrong button.
Okay, that happens.
As one does.
Yes, thank you, ER, for bringing me back. Yes, I was moving.
Yes.
I was moving. I clicked something that I didn't mean to click because I was moving on my screen. Yes, sir. Yeah, no, Matic, that was actually me and not our internet. that was the fault. But we are over time, I see.
Center, yes, but the bottom center is where the ask a question field is. If you just want to check that out real quick and see if there's anything else that you want to make sure you answer.
So that's where I was heading when I somehow clicked something.
Yeah, I see one more question that I missed from Kelso Wyatt.
Oh, yes, I was just going to read that.
Exactly. It's interesting about modernism working in revolt to urbanization. That's kind of how we often see it. And artists like Oldenburg, they engaged with the urban scale and with the public experience. So what is the role of the galleries and artists basically in the gentrification of New York neighborhoods, particularly, of course, the East Village that you also talked about, and something that has happened over the last 50 to 60 years. So how did that come up in your research? How did that play into the patterns of urbanization and Oldenburg's relationship to these shifts? Was driven often the arcades.
That is an excellent question that I am going to think more about. And Kelso, I would love to have a conversation with you about that directly, if you are up for that. Kelso is a former student.
Oh, great.
who's worked on modern architecture. So that's a great question, but one I want to give some more thought to. But thank you.
Okay, well, I think this was really exciting to talk about this different aspects of Oldenburg's work, particularly in relation to art and architecture, this interdisciplinary discourse that you so much brought out in, I think, your book, and kind of just taking this frame of urbanism as a critical lens for an artist. And I very much hope that happens in future research. So again, just to conclude, these were fantastic questions. It was great to have all the participation from the audience.
Yes, thank you
Katherine for elaborating and talking about your process in all kind of different ways. And also great, thanks so much for Charis Books to host that event and bring us all together.
Yes.
And again, congratulations, Katherine.
Thank you.
It's great to celebrate and to have the occasion to do that.
Well, thank you for joining me. Thank you, Charis and Agnes Scott, for hosting this. It's been fun for me, and I look forward to continuing these conversations, and certainly to reading future scholarship. I hope certainly that the conversations continue. So one of the last things I did before the pandemic was go to New York to attend the opening of Jordan Castile's show at the New Museum. She's an Agnes alum, and to have a glass of champagne with Claes, and I let him know I would raise a glass to him. I want to raise a glass to all of you. I work in dialogue, I work in collaboration, I don't just work on collaboration. And I appreciate all the ways that so many of you who are here have been part of shaping this book. I mean, I'm looking at the audience, and some of you are archivists who helped me find these things, and readers of this project, and people who steward collections. And Dominique, thank you for that comment. Dominique has a cartoon from his Oberlin days in the chapter on the Allen Memorial Art Museum. And it's just been so wonderful. And also to have so many former students who have helped shape this book since I started at Agnes Scott. It means the world to me. So thank you all for being part of my process. Cheers.
Yeah, cheers.
Well, congratulations.
Thank
and
you.
We're so honored to get to help you celebrate. So just a reminder to everyone, just click this teal button to buy the Accidental Possibilities of the City from Charis. We realize
Yes.
that not everybody is able to buy it, but we do really recommend that you recommend it to your institution's library. So also recommend it to public libraries in your area. So one of the things that we think are really important is letting local librarians know about books that you would like them to carry. So both for academic institutions, but also public libraries. That's one of the great ways that we can support academic presses. So please do that as well. Feel free to get in touch. And thank you both so much. This was really lovely. I learned a lot.
Thank you so much.
Yes, have a great